everybody, and welcome to Alan Robson's Grisly Tales. And as always, we're getting stuck straight into an amazing string of awful and horrific stories, many of them that you will not know anything about, but once that I've mentioned them, you can go online and you can look up at photographs and perhaps press coverage. I'm starting off in France, back in 1926, because many of the worst and grisliest murders always seem to happen and we never get to hear about them. Well, it's all about a pair of sisters, Leah and Christine Papin. They worked as servants, skivvies, for the Nilsen family in France back in 1926. Now, the family thought they were a bit odd. They would never talk to anybody but themselves, and they weren't showing any interest in anything the family were doing. They were essentially just doing what they were told. But they were fast workers, they obeyed what the family told them, and they stayed with them loyally for almost 7 years. And then, on a dark, windy night in February 1933, Monsieur Nilsen, who had been waiting for his wife at a friend's house, came home to find his woman and their adult daughter dead on the floor in a pool of blood. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, their eyes had been gouged out roughly, and then their faces smashed in, their eyeballs placed staring up at the man from the kitchen floor. The Papin sisters were locked in their room, and the husband got a locksmith to come and open the door, and the police said that they found the Papin sisters lying on the bed together, covered with blood, with a bloody hammer nearby. It seemed they'd used the back end of the hammer to gouge the eyes out, and then, whilst the two were still alive, yet blinded, they were smashed to a pulp with the hammer. Now, the Papin sisters confessed, and while they were in prison, Christine Papin became really distressed because she was away from her sister for the very first time in their lives. So she was granted permission to see Leah. Reports said that the sisters seemed to be unnaturally close. A lot of them said that they were having a sexual relationship too, although the doctors who examined the Papin sisters said there was no evidence of that. A few months later, Christine suffered a mental breakdown and she tried to gouge out her own eyes with a spoon. After their trial, Christine was sentenced to life in prison for apparently being the mastermind behind the murders, and Leah was eventually released from prison in 1943, and she got a job in a French hotel under a brand new identity. She died in the early 1980s, with the people she worked for never knowing what she'd done. Now, let's have another one. This time, let's have a Brit. A British serial killer by the name of John Haigh. John George Haigh, in fact. He used to get rid of his victims' bodies by putting them into sulfuric acid. Now, he was absolutely convinced he was getting away with murder, literally, because he thought, without a body, well, there isn't a crime. And he got a bit arrogant when he led the police himself to the remains of his sixth and final victim, a 69-year-old woman called Olive Deacon. And while on trial, Haigh pleaded insanity and told the court that before he put them into the sulfuric acid, he drank the blood of his victims. Now, this guy was found guilty in 1949, and a few months later, he was hanged by the neck until he was distinctly not well at all. Okay, we tell you these are very, very famous and gruesome and grisly killings, yet most of them you'll not have heard of, and that's what makes it so fascinating. Now, where were you in the late 80s? Yeah, most of you would be around somewhere. How come you didn't hear about Robert Berdella? Because in the late 1980s, Berdella tortured and killed 6 men. He chopped their bodies into tiny small pieces and stuffed their remains into dog food bags, feeding them to the local dogs around the parish. The New York Daily News discovered this because he kept detailed notes on each of his victims, which is a bit of a giveaway when the police check your house, and it proved that he was responsible, and yet Berdella almost got away with it. If it hadn't been for his 7th victim, well, would-be victim, a 22-year-old called Christopher Bryson, who'd been invited back to Berdella's home, where he did the killing and the torturing and the chopping into small pieces, and he managed to escape from the 2nd floor, climbing down a drain pipe outside Berdella's home. Had he not done that, Berdella might well still be killing people to this day. Berdella was arrested, originally charged with sexual assault on Christopher Bryson, the one that escaped. But after the police got a search warrant, they found his notes. They also found human remains and all of the wallets of the other victims. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, and karma being what it is, he died of a particularly painful heart attack in prison in 1992, and frankly, we'll not miss him. Now, on the robsonsworld.com website, we have reenacted what it's like to be a victim of a serial killer. And the serial killer that I chose was Dennis Nilsen. Now, a wax model of Nilsen is escorted to its position in prison in the Chamber of Horrors at Madame Tussauds Waxworks in London. But he terrorised the capital in the late 70s and early 1980s. He killed 15 men over a 5-year period. Nilsen would pick up young men in bars and take them back to his home, and there he would strangle or drown them. Then, once they were dead, he'd bathe and dress the bodies. Some say he masturbated over them and orgasmed by the thrill of the kill. He admitted to the police that he kept the bodies for extended periods of time so that he could have sex with them and talk to them. They ended up catching him because he tried to wedge a lot of human flesh down the drain, and human fat filled the drain pipes, blocking them around his home and making the sinks overflow in other apartments nearby. He's currently serving a life sentence at Full Sutton Prison in Yorkshire. But don't worry, that sucker's never getting out. And if you want to find out how Neilson did what he did and with whom he did it, check out robsonsworld.com. There is a series of shorts all linked together to tell you his full story, and you can hear him and his family talking about it on those particular shows. Check him out. But let's go back to the late 1980s, early 1990s with somebody else you probably haven't heard of, Herbert Baumeister. Now, this guy would lure gay men back to his pool house for a swim and a burger. Let's be cool. Then he'd strangle them, dumping their bodies in the woods behind his house and letting the bars get to them because he lived in Canada. Baumeister had his pool area decorated with mannequins, and it made it look as if they were having a pool party and there were dozens and dozens of people there, when in fact there was just him and his victim. Baumeister's young son, Eric, even stumbled across the remains of one of the victims while he was playing in the backyard. And once Baumeister realised that the police were onto him, he fled to Ontario, Canada, and shot himself in the head at Pinery Provincial Park. But he left a suicide note. He blamed his failing marriage and his failing business for the reason of his suicide, and he never confessed to any of the murders. but the police know that he killed up to 20 innocent people. They found remains of 17 just around the property. And they couldn't even estimate how many bodies bears, wolves and other critters could have dragged away. Now I know how much you guys like the darker stuff, so let me tell you about a woman with an amazing nickname, the Torture Mother. Yeah, it's a woman called Gertrude Baniszewski. Because back in 1965, the police found a skinny, rotting, emaciated body of a young 16-year-old Indianapolis girl, Sylvia Likens. She was completely covered with over 4,000 cigarette burns on her little body. She was sprawled out on a filthy, lace-covered mattress in the house of Gertrude Baniszewski. Sylvia and her sister Jenny stayed with the Baniszewskis because their parents were travellers, carnival workers, circus people, and they travelled a lot, so they left the two girls with Gertrude Baniszewski. The girl's dad paid Baniszewski $20 a week for looking after his daughters, and if the money arrived late, Baniszewski would take her anger out on the two little girls. Eventually, she started beating on Sylvia alone, but this wasn't a crime of an adult beating a child. Baniszewski was the mother of 7 children. All of them lived in their house. All of them were victims of violent and sadistic attacks. And on seeing their mother attacking Sylvia, they would attack her too. On numerous occasions, forcing things like rolling pins inside her lower body. 5 or 6 of them holding her down. Neighbourhood kids, some as young as 10, were invited into the house to see Sylvia getting tortured, and not one reported anything to the police. In October 1965, Sylvia was beaten to death. Baniszewski apparently forced a neighbour to call the police to tell them that Sylvia had run away. But when the police arrived at the home, Jenny Likens, Sylvia's younger sister, whispered to one of the police officers, "Look, get me out of here and I'll tell you everything." Baniszewski only got 20 years in prison and was then released. She moved to Iowa, changed her name, and then karma came a-calling. She died of lung cancer in 1990, a slow and awful death. The others, mainly children, all got away with short sentences, if they got any sentence at all. It seems that karma is the only justice for some people. And let's face it, in Britain, the criminal justice system totally sucks. Let's talk about another grisly story, and this one is a lady called Katherine Knight. Now, she was an Aussie, and she stabbed her partner 37 times until he died. While he was still alive, she would stab him again. His name was John Price. Now, you would have thought that's bad enough for a woman who purportedly loved the man to stab somebody 37 times until all life had disappeared through the stab wounds. But Katherine then decided to skin him, decapitated his head, and started cooking up parts of his body. She set a dining room table for 2 and served his cooked meat with baked potatoes and side vegetables. She put handwritten notes next to each table setting with the names of Price's children on them. What she wanted to do was to serve his human meat to his children for dinner. When police finally arrived at their house, John Price not having been seen for weeks, they burst in to find Katherine in a coma, completely out of it with pills spilled all over the floor. They also found Price's head boiling in a pot of soup on the kitchen stove. boiling in chicken stock so that it would be nice and tender. Knight was the first woman to be sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, and she's currently in prison in Silverwater Correctional Complex in New South Wales, Australia. With a story like that, how come we don't know these things? Now, it's weird, because if you peruse any of the porn sites, and I think one or two of you may have just had a little peek from time to time, you may occasionally see someone who's keen on women's feet, or men's feet, or feet in general. Now, I am a fan of my feet. I've got ginger hair, I have little ginger toes. In fact, my toes all resemble little tiny hamsters. Little hamster families, with the big daddy hamster all the way down to the teeny weeny hamster at the end. Now, Jerry Brudos was a shoe fetish killer. And back in 1968, in January, women in Portland were terrorized by this strange man who had a foot fetish. 4 women vanished completely. A year later, a fisherman found the remains of a 22-year-old woman whose name was Linda Salee. She disappeared the year before, and police then ended up finding 4 more bodies and eventually tracked them all back to Brudos. He confessed to the murders in gory detail. It seems he wanted to be caught, and he wanted to tell everybody just how evil he was. Because after keeping the body of his first victim for several months until it stunk, this was in order to dress her up and the police think have sex with her dead body, he eventually dumped the victim in the river, but not before sawing off one of her feet to use for trying on heels and taking photos of the foot in various shoes. And in another horrific find in the Brudos house, they discovered that he also kept souvenirs of his crimes like shoes, bras, girdles, and he even made a paperweight out of one of their breasts. So as you see, there seems to be no end to bloody murderers. Let's have another one you probably haven't heard of. Dennis Rader, he was known as the BTK killer. He used to break into victims' houses in and around Sedgwick County in Kansas. This is after he'd stalked them for weeks to see what their habits were. He would then bind them, torture them by cutting off various strips of skin while they were still alive, and finally, when he'd had his fun, he would kill them. So that was his modus operandi, BTK, bind, torture, kill. And he got his nickname from that, according to the local paper. He ended up killing 10 people between 1974 and 1991, but he didn't get arrested until 2005. But once he was caught, the police got a search warrant and went through Rader's home with a fine-tooth comb, and he found photographs of Rader with all of his victims. He was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder, and he's now serving 10 consecutive life sentences at El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, which means he could get out in the year 2174. Now, as you know, in the Grisly Trail of Paris, I ended up talking to a cannibal serial killer, Nico Claw. You can hear all of that on the robsonsworld.com website. Now, he's walking free in Paris right now as we speak. And there's another cannibal, Izzy Sagawa, the Japanese cannibal, who is still walking free himself. This famous cannibal is notorious in his own country because he grew up belonging to a really rich family, but that didn't stop him having an urge to eat human flesh. When he was 23, he was arrested for attempting to rape a young girl. He entered the apartment of a tall German woman who lived in Tokyo and attacked her. The police didn't realize He wasn't trying to have sex with her, he was attempting to eat her. And even though he bit off a piece of her flesh, Sagawa, who's only 5 foot tall, was obsessed with big, much taller Western women. When he got to 32, Sagawa went to study literature in France, where a lot of big women are. He even managed to get a PhD, and there he befriended a classmate, a good 4 to 5 inches taller than he, 25-year-old Dutch lady Renée Hartevelt. The friendship was one-sided, and it proved deadly for the girl, because in 1981, on another one of those dark nights, Sagawa invited her over to work on a poetry assignment that they both had. And during that poetry assignment, I don't think the verse went too well, because he ended up shooting her in the neck and then eating various parts of her body, including her cooked and broiled vagina, over a 2-day span. He tried to dump the leftovers of her body in a lake nearby, but got caught in the act. He was held by the police in a cell for 2 years before being deemed legally insane by the French and deported back to Japan. Once in Japan, he was declared sane by psychologists who signed him out of the mental institution where he was being held. Nobody challenged it, and he currently lives as a free man in Japan. However, who's to say he's not going to strike somewhere? For how can you start your life like that and not be tainted forever? Now, just before we dive into some more grisly stories, I want to share some facts with you. Now, these are facts. These are not allegations. These are not fantasies. These are absolute facts. They cannot be denied because they are true. And I just want to tell you some things about the church that you're not likely to hear in a Sunday school class. If you believe in God, you believe. Keep the faith. May your God go with you wherever you go. However, these are true things about the church. Do you know the book of Esther? It's a book in the Bible, if you haven't read it. It doesn't mention God once in the whole book. Also, the church frowned on people committing adultery right from the very start, and yet the church didn't ban men having sex with animals until the Council of Ankara in 314 AD. You know the confessional box? You know when, if you're Catholic, you go to confession and you tell a priest all of the things that technically he's not allowed to do, but probably does anyway? Well, the confessional box was actually invented in the Middle Ages, and the reason it was invented was to prevent women from being sexually assaulted and raped by priests. They don't tell you these things in Sunday school. Also, the early Christian church declared that the Virgin Mary was impregnated by God through her ear. Now, there was paranoia at the time about sex through the ear, so it became widespread, and a lot of people believed that the naked ear was considered sexually explicit, hence the fashion for nuns to wear wimples hiding their sexy lugs. I know these things are ridiculous, but genuinely this is what the church believed for hundreds and in some cases thousands of years. How about this? The Catholic Church accepts that cannibalism is a justifiable means of saving your own life. So if there's two of you and you're stuck in a difficult situation, eat your partner. It's the Catholic way. Onan, the son of Judah. Now forgive my parlance here, but he is the patron saint of masturbators, right? Onan. He was the son of Judah, and he spilled his seed all over the place. He was, a bit of a I nearly said tosser, but you know what I mean. And now this is what it says in the Old Testament. You can, if you want to look it up, Genesis 38, 8 to 10. He became the Bible's only masturbator, although I would imagine quite a few of them were at it. This particular passage for the church's unreserved condemnation of masturbation for centuries gave the expression onanism to the world. It's a term for self-abuse, and it was well used during Victorian times. Now, the fact of the matter is, we had Dr. Miriam Stoppard on the show, and she said that masturbation is actually a good thing. Gets out your angst. If you don't have a partner, it's a way to relax and keep calm, and it's a positive thing, not a negative thing, unless you're on the bus. The Old Testament book, Ecclesiasticus, now, that tells you to clear your stomach by vomiting before or during a big meal to make room for more food. The Old Testament tells you to do that. So if you don't do that already, streak of lightning any time. The Bible was also full of lepers. It was written at a time when any skin defect, even if somebody just had acne, or, teenagers get spots on the chin, that would get you branded as a leper and totally shunned by society. The church declared that. Anybody with spots was a leper. Most lepers weren't really lepers. They were sufferers of syphilis, because at the time that might give you a pockmarked face. And also, they would be written off as dead. They'd even have a requiem mass sung for them, as was the custom for all living lepers. Then they'd be stuck in an area of land miles away from decent living citizens. Now, in the 12th and 13th centuries, the church declared a holy war on cats, because they apparently were the ambassadors of the devil. Now, the devil hadn't cropped up in the Bible until the middle 1100s, and he only cropped up at all because people weren't going to church. So the Bible was rewritten and devil was put in there to scare people. You're going to burn in hell, the devil's coming for you. A reason to drive people to the church, and it did. But because the devil was created, suddenly black cats particularly were assigned ambassadors of the devil. And after 200 years of persecution, the population of cats across Europe was pretty much almost wiped out. Therefore, the rat population tripled, quadrupled, and increased. An explosion of rats everywhere, bringing with it the plague and loads of people dying. And it was all because the Catholic Church declared war on cats. So the church then reversed its position, saying that cats were lovely things, and said anybody abusing a cat would be excommunicated, which is the most direct hypocrisy you're ever likely to see. And also, just another one, for 540 years, the church said that if you wore a wig, you would be excommunicated. Yeah, they don't tell you these things, do they, when you're getting your sermon on a Sunday? Now, we've had all kinds of different things, from gouging out eyes to feeding families' dead bodies and having sex with the dead. It's been, well, a typical walk in the downright peculiar, like it always is. We haven't had a massacre yet. Until now. Now, Tennessee became a land so inviting back in pioneer times, with huge swathes of land just waiting to be pegged out and claimed. And because of that, many of the so-called new religions began to head their way. Yes, your standard Christian was suspicious of anything new and different, meaning there would be an awful lot of bumping heads. But with an influx of Mormons suddenly arriving, locals began protesting almost immediately. You see, at the time, Mormons took themselves several wives, and they allowed their children to get married as young as 10. In Britain around this time, mind, 12-year-olds were allowed to get married, yet to these uncivilized folk, it was just going too far. And the first man to suffer was a fella called Francis Sullivan. Now, he had 4 wives and 6 children. And as he built a fence around his property, he was confronted by a gang of men from the town. He was shouted down as committing sins against God, and that he could only have one wife. The other three were obviously just whores. Now, Sullivan did what any decent man would do. He defended his wives, as one of the men hurled a rock at his head, knocking him to the ground, and once down, like every cowardly gang, they all dived in, kicking at him, until one picked up a wooden axe handle and swung it down with both hands, shattering his skull like a melon. All of them were hit by the blood that burst from the skull. The gang then rearranged the dead man's fence posts so that they could claim much of his land. And when his family found him, they raced to the local sheriff, who suggested something heavy must have fallen on him. He didn't like Mormons either. And having declared this obvious murder as an accident, he was telling every other religious bigot that they had carte blanche to deal with Mormons the way they felt fit. Mormon women were spat on, kicked, scratched, and even pushed into mud by the other town's women. The Sullivans moved out and ended up at Salt Lake City, where persecuted Mormons found a place of safety. This entire religious spat finally came to a head on the 10th of August in 1884 at a Mormon farmhouse on the East Fork of Cane Creek. A group of Mormons were holding a meeting, ironically about how to deal with all of the animosity that was being shown against them. And just then, a mob of townspeople, all wearing very stupid disguises, appeared and began screaming at the house. They were yelling at how having more than one wife was a sin against God. The children were sent to hide in the cornfields as the crowd began hurling flaming torches at the house. The women raced out of the back, trying to avoid the rocks, stones, and occasional gunshot. One woman was shot in the back, but she would make a full recovery. The same could not be said about two of the church's elders, John H. Gibbs and William S. Berry. Both were beaten to death, hopefully dying before they started stabbing and shooting bullets into their corpses. Over 114 bullets and over 2,000 stab wounds on two human beings' bodies. Two of their associates, who weren't even Mormon, but they liked the guys, were also killed. Some say because they witnessed this fancy dress freak show. Martin Kondo and J.R. Hudson tried to talk their way out of it, for they had started recognizing the badly disguised citizens. Kondo said, "McCready, don't you think I can see that it's you?" Then he spun around. "Ross, Collins, Fleet, Harris, and Duggan." He said, "We're not Mormons. Just let us go and we won't speak a word of this." But what if they did? This wild group of murderers would all be stepping out onto the gallows. Just then, Fleet held his shotgun up in the face of Condor and fired, peeling off his face and shattering the bones, leaving a huge hole where his face had been. His body flew a few yards through the air and lay at the feet of Hudson. Although in shock, he decided to shout at the people, "How can you call yourself Christians when you murder innocent men like this? It'll be straight to hell for you." Just then a rifle cracked and a bullet hit his thigh, forcing him down to the ground, and the mob was on him. Axes, cornflails, hatchets, clubs, knives, swords hammered into his helpless body. And then, as he lay there dying, he was peppered with bullets. This crowd knew how badly they needed him to die. The following day, the sheriff declared that the crime must have been carried out by a strange gang passing through the province, describing how other gangs had burnt down farms, barns and outhouses while rampaging across the state. This showed how he was happy not to investigate the people who had actually voted him into office. Because he didn't like Mormons, they voted for him. no one was ever prosecuted for any of the crimes, particularly the one known as the Mormon massacre, despite half of the victims being standard Christians. Now, that site on Cane Creek is one of the most haunted places in America, as not only is it said to have the ghosts of those cut to pieces, but also souls of Confederate soldiers that nightly relive their march home after the war. Tens of thousands of photographs exist and hours of film footage capturing the dead in motion. Jeb Urquhart visited the area doing a dissertation on the murders, so he was taking photographs when he inadvertently captured a picture of one of the dead Mormons wearing a dark black hat and frock coat standing by a copse of trees. The photograph made front page news of the local press in the 1980s. Now, should you ever decide to pop up to the Scottish borders, I would recommend you have a day in Jedburgh. It's a nice sleepy little border town with Jedburgh Castle right in the middle. And it's been right in the middle of the conflict between England and Scotland. So it had a reputation for a thing called Jedda's Justice. Jedburgh's own justice, Jedda's Justice. Rather than give anybody a day in court, with all of the time wasted on arguments for and against, anybody who stepped out of line would be hanged. Many were hanged at the castle, many at the prison next to it. But for almost 600 years, they had their favourite hanging tree. In the early 1500s, no one wanted to be caught in the Jedburgh area doing anything, because people were hanged there for stealing bread, riding someone else's horse, and even for not showing respect for their betters. That means rich people. Severe punishment for basic, normal misdemeanors, but because of this, very few people living locally would ever commit any crimes. And even so, the hanging tree still did brisk business. Now, this was the time of the border reivers, so people from all of the families connected would swing there, and anyone trying to run away from serving in either army, the Scottish or the English, would be executed too. So swift was Jedda's justice that when other courts were busy, they sent their cases up to Jedburgh, where there wouldn't even be a court case. They'd just decide they were guilty and hang them. People from as far away as Edinburgh and Newcastle upon Tyne were committed for so-called trial, yet instead they just took them to the tree and hanged them, torturing many of them to get a confession if there was any doubt. The main problem was that the Armstrongs, the Milburns, the Robsons, the Charltons, the Turnbulls, and all the other famous Reiver families believed that they weren't doing anything wrong. They thought they were merely surviving. If somebody had what they didn't have, they'd attack them and take it. But the worst family in the Jedburgh area were the Turnbulls, a brood who would obey no laws at all. They stole, they raped, they murdered as they saw fit, and they became such a local scourge that even King James IV intervened and demanded that every 10th person called Turnbull out of over 500 in the Jedburgh area, men, women and even a 4-month-old baby, were taken to the hangman and dispatched. Still, this didn't calm down the Turnbulls. Finally, the king rode to Jedburgh with an army and executed 200 of them. Over 250 other Turnbulls died doing battle with the royal retinue. And this kind of solved the problem for a few years. However, the Turnbulls bred, and within 10 years they were border reiving again. In 1517, Will Turnbull and his wife Molly murdered 2 travellers on their way to Edinburgh and were arrested. Thing is, Molly was 8.5 months pregnant when sentenced with her husband to hang side by side. And during the hanging, her waters broke and the baby fell from her as she twitched and contorted. As the noose choked her to death, she screamed an ungodly squeal of angst before all speech was finally silenced. There, still attached to the dead, swinging mother, attached by its umbilical cord, a tiny baby writhed around the floor of the gallows. The hangman stamped on it, stopping it from crying. then kicked its lifeless corpse into the crowd of cheering onlookers. Others hanged in Jedburgh were an endless list of women that superstition declared as witches. More often than not, they were the local village healers capable of herbal cures for common ailments, yet many were declared as heretics, and they would dance in the air as their punishment. Now, one of my passions is to bring to you stories that should be common knowledge to everyone, and yet simply isn't. Have you heard of Jedwabne? No. Well, I found out about it some years ago and wanted to go there and do a few live shows. Never got the chance. This small Polish town, Jedwabne, was originally built up with Jewish money back in the early 1600s. It became a thriving and gentle place to live. Amongst the ordinary people, the Catholic majority, 60%, got on well with the 40% Jewish population. They often shared ceremonies, parties, festivals, and they got on really well. However, in the early 1930s, the Polish National Party began to echo the same messages Hitler was beginning to espouse in Germany. He blamed every one of society's problems on the Jews, particularly their grasp on local business and industry. In Poland, they were looking over their border at their neighbour, seeing attacks on Jewish shops and factories, and they began to do their own lethal form of skullduggery. At first it was merely rabble-rousing, the occasional broken window, a bit of graffiti smeared in paint on a wall. The problem is, when racism infests the simple-minded, it's only a matter of time before someone decides to cross the line between unpleasant and downright evil. An Irishman called Martin O'Reilly made me aware of this story when I was hosting my late-night phone-in show back in 1992. Now, he was obviously an elderly gentleman, and he claimed to have been in Poland and witnessed the sick beginnings that would lead to the massacre of the innocents. He told that massive late-night audience, "I was there visiting Paula, a girl that I'd met in Warsaw in 1932. I was on holiday and she was studying at the university, and we had what you would call a holiday fling, and both of us thought that would be all it was. But I just couldn't get this girl out of my mind. We sent really lovely letters back and forth, and she invited me to go over after her studies ended and she had qualified as a nurse. She was due to take up a full-time job at a small hospital in a place called Kolno. So we had 3 incredible weeks together before she started work. I worked for my dad doing building work, so I'd taken 4 weeks off. So she began her new career, and I would see her after she'd finished work at her mother's when she returned. Yet on the second night, she came in with her nose cut and a black eye, and we all asked what had happened. Well, a Jewish woman had been raped by a group of nationalists. They had then tried to beat her to death, so she couldn't identify them. But miraculously, this brave young woman clung on to life, despite having broken arms, broken legs, broken ribs, a broken nose, her head split open, and a bottle had been pushed into her lower body and then smashed with a kick. Paula had tended to her after the doctors had operated on her for over 4 hours to remove shards of glass, and then, at about 7:30, when most people had gone home, 3 nationalist men burst in wearing masks and punched Paula to the floor, kicked her in the face, then ran into the poor woman's room and fired 5 bullets into her head. They raced out, and within 5 minutes the police were there investigating this vicious murder. Paula was quaking, shaking and sobbing all at the same time, while she lay on the floor pretending to be unconscious, something that had probably saved her life. But while she was lying down there, she noticed one of the men had a distinctive buckle on his shoes. She was about to tell the police about it when another nurse tripped and fell at her feet. Paula bent down to help her up, and as she did, her blood turned to ice. One of the police officers, in fact the inspector, was wearing those shoes. She had the presence of mind to say that she didn't see anything, and after 10 minutes they left. Paula begged me to take her to England, so I swore I would do my best. She spoke about how people all over Poland had started to spread hatred about Jewish people. Attacks, rapes and murders were becoming common, and the police never ever caught the guilty. In fact, many of the police were Polish nationalists, so they didn't even look. It gave them the perfect platform to hide their vile assaults on innocent people, all the while claiming that they were the representatives of God, also representing Catholicism and Judaism. On getting home, I made all the calls to organise her travel to Durham, where I was living, he said. We got engaged and she worked briefly at the hospital in Dryburn. I joined the Border Regiment and my fellow Celts during the war, and one leave I managed to get home in time for the new year of 1942. She told me that 3 of her Jewish friends, all nurses, had been murdered in a massacre. I presumed that it was just another Nazi atrocity. We were used to hearing about them then. Yet she was crying, saying that it had been carried out by her own people. Many Poles had hated Russian occupation that had lasted around 20 months. They described that as a reign of terror. The Russians had been brutal, but life had returned to a type of normality. If you didn't provoke them, they left people alone. So when the Germans chased the Russians out, taking over the role of invader, the nationalists supported their every move. They knew that if the Germans needed someone to administer the Polish people, they would be well paid and they would wield immense power. So most of those roles were given to the nationalists, who swore undying allegiance to the Reich. They were as vicious as the SS, looking for any reason to prove to their German overlords that they were as loyal and as violent. The ordinary people of both religions loathed them. On one occasion, a little 4-year-old young boy had run into the legs of an SS officer. A Nationalist Party member stepped out, tripped the lad, then stamped on him until he was dead, as his mother watched and screamed. When she leant down over the bleeding corpse of her beloved son, the Nationalist pulled out a knife and slit her throat. The sheer contempt that they had, even for their own people. Paula cried and cried about it and wanted to return to help her people, but it was wartime. So she couldn't, not even when her parents were shot by the Nazis because they had helped an RAF airman avoid capture. When they searched their house, they found a packet of Player's bachelor cigarettes left by the British chap they had hidden. It was enough for Paula's mother, father and 15-year-old brother to be machine-gunned to death up against their own house wall. The massacre she had told me about had led to over 30 other massacres, all carried out by Polish nationalists against their own people. But it was that first one that took place at Jedwabne, where Paula's Jewish nursing friends were working. The very first Germans had just arrived to occupy the town. The SS and Gestapo were on their way. So the nationalists wanted to do something to impress the Germans. The police inspector gathered his officers, armed them, and gathered a mob of those who hated or who were jealous of the well-to-do Jewish population. And that very night, they went house to house, dragging out every single Jewish family. They shot the rabbi and burned down the small family synagogue. Men, women, and children were dragged, beaten, and brutalized. Soon, 304 of them were interred in a huge barn on the edge of town. This, the beginning of numerous massacres. Yet even when they were in that barn, they didn't believe that any harm would be done to them. They were Polish, and the people outside were fellow Poles. They were then told that their money and their property had been seized, and that they would be forced to leave Jedwabne. Yet when they tried to get out of the barn, Those guarding the outside would fire a machine gun at the door, killing and wounding those inside. After an hour or so, they began to settle down in the dark building, some praying, others trying to calm their terrified children. They heard a bumping and a banging from outside, but no one had any way of knowing what it was. But outside, the Polish nationalists were pushing hay carts against all of the doors, nailing closed the shutters on windows, and spreading thick black oil on the walls. Then there was the smell of petrol. At first, those inside thought nothing too much about it, as inside the barn was a tractor and several cans of petrol. And then suddenly, through the thin edges of the wood, there was a flickering. All four sides of the barn had been set on fire. Outside, the nationalists had set up machine gun positions to murder anybody who tried to escape. This had been the dream of the vicious nationalists as far back as 1931. Now, thanks to the Nazis, they could do it without any risk of repercussions. The SS arrived and could clearly smell the burned human flesh and commended the nationalists for their loyalty. It was, in fact, treason against their own countrymen. 2 days later, over 800 Jews would be killed the same way in Radzelau. The disease of ethnic cleansing spread like wildfire across Poland, and the nationalists had a field day. Many Polish towns and villages had taken a surge of extra Jewish people trying to escape from the Holocaust. So one by one, the purge and the stamping out of the Jews continued. Nilsen, Gonadz, Narenka, Wiesnow, Rajgrod, Koreshish, and then Paula's own town, Kolno. Over 40 families that she knew well and had played with as a child or studied with at nursing college were exterminated. Then more and more until the Nazis began to organise their transport by train to the death camps. In 1945, Samuel Wasserstein was asked to interview survivors of the Polish camps, and many remembered the horror of discovering that it was their own people selling them out. Shmuel wrote, "The other brutality was when they ordered battered Jews to dig a hole for the graves for other murdered Jews. Then they would be murdered, and the next group of Jews buried them, then they waited to die. It was impossible to represent the brutalities of these hooligans. We have no similar behaviour in our entire history. Beards of Jewish people were set on fire on their faces, babies taken from their mother's breast and smashed off walls or stamped on. Good people were beaten murderously and others forced to sing and dance. And no matter who they were or how they begged, then came the main activity, the burning. The dead and living all hurled into a pit that was on fire. They would try to clamber out, being kicked back in as the flesh burned from their skin. The entire town was surrounded by armed guards, so there was no way to escape. Any of the non-Jewish Poles who tried to hide them or help them escape were thrown onto the bonfire too. And after the mass murder, the nationalists went back house to house, stealing money and anything of value that they came across, just like the parasites that they were. There are people living in those same houses today because their families passed them down the family lane, all because they murdered the family of the person who had earned such a property. Each time the event was choreographed the same way. The Jewish people of the town would be lined up in rows of 4, the rabbi and the shoshet, the butcher, in the front. They were given a red banner in order to sing and dance as they led their people into the pre-prepared barn. All the way there, these hooligans would bestially beat them up, slash them with knives, or drag out an attractive Jewess and she would be gang raped then shot. Other men played musical instruments loudly to try and cover the screaming of the terror-stricken crowd. By now they knew what was going to happen. Some hanged themselves from the beams of the barn, others sliced their own wrists and those of their own children. They were in absolute despair. Any trying to fight back were riddled with machine gun fire. The barn then doused with kerosene and set alight. And then the nationalists went robbing their homes, and they would find the sick or children hidden, and they were dragged out onto the street, kerosene poured over their heads, and a match lit. On one occasion, triplets less than a year old were thrown onto the cobbles and burned alive. Some good Poles did what they could. Antonina and Alexander Wyszkowski saved hundreds of Jews, hiding them and getting them out of the country from their small farmhouse in Janczukl. From early 1942 until the Russians took back the country in January 1945. For that whole period they had put their lives on the line. Yet not long afterwards they were savagely attacked by local nationalists who had heard that they had defended Jews. They were forced to move closer to the capital Warsaw, settling in Milonowek. They won huge acclaim from the government and that of Israel for their incredible courage in the face of what seemed to be impossible odds. So who paid for this crime? Well, after the war, 22 nationalists were arrested and found to be totally uneducated and illiterate. They were charged with treason against Poland, yet only one was condemned to death. The thing is, word leaked that they had all been tortured by the UB, the Polish security police, and this led to an inquiry funded by rich nationalists spending the fortune stolen from the Jews that they had murdered and robbed. And this leads to another story about a former police inspector and nationalist, the man who had put the Jedwabne massacre in place. His name was Romano Grosicki. That was the name that Paula had given to the authorities, for he had given her a form to complete after that Jewess had been shot in hospital. He was investigated, and 3 other nationalist officers vouched for him, all declaring that they had all fought against the Germans, not supported them. Yet the Celtic thread untangles again in this far-off land. O'Neill, who had reached the rank of sergeant during wartime, said, "I took Paula back to Poland in 1947, once travel was started again. It was a miracle when we found 2 of her aunties and a cousin still alive, but she was given such a difficult homecoming. We visited the cemetery where her parents were dumped in a mass grave, and just then she screamed on seeing this man in the street. She told me she was certain that he had been one of the men who had attacked the hospital, and according to her parents, had organised the very first barn massacre. When she reacted to him in the street, this piece of shit actually laughed, said something to the man with him. Paula told me that she had called her Zid Kochanek, a Jew lover. I lost it and was about to smack him one, but she pulled me back. And later that night in our hotel in Bialystok, as Kolno and Jedwabne were fairly close, we talked through the night. The following day I told her that I had something to do, leaving her to go shopping with her cousin. She was puzzled, but there were some British soldiers in the Russian sector, and I told her I was going to visit them. I did. I returned to the hotel late that night, dropped off by 3 soldiers in a jeep. The following day we got the train back to France and then onwards to Britain. But on getting back home, Paula tells me that she had received a letter from her cousin that Grosicki had been found burned to death in a barn in Kolno. 2 other men had been beaten to death, but it seemed that he had been burned alive. O'Neill said live on air, "Fortunately, she didn't smell any kerosene on my clothes when I got back to the hotel." So I asked him, "So you took him out?" And O'Reilly replied, "All I can say is that what comes around goes around. Some human beings need to be put down. We learned that from Hitler, surely." He then put the phone down. An incredible story from a man who seemed to want to offload his conscience. We had callers from Jewish people thanking him, the majority commending him for righting a wrong, and one racist demanding that he be brought to justice. I received a call from the police the following day, asking me to give them the telephone number and the name of the caller. Yet when I looked in my files, Surprisingly, there was a page missing. No idea how that happened. I'm usually so thorough. After all, I'm a Celt like he was. And that is our grisly tale for tonight. I hope you've enjoyed them. There's more to come. Please help us if you can and support us on the robsonsworld.com page. There's a donation thing if you like what you're getting. And we hope there's a lot more to come. Also, of course, on Robson's World, the brand new Alien Jesus 4, where we talk to people who have been abducted by aliens. A lot of stuff never ever heard on radio anywhere. You can hear it exclusively on Alien Jesus 4. Give that one a try. And if you haven't got any of the Alien Jesus series, that really is something you need to put in your collection. But until we are together again, thank you for listening. Thank you for your time. And until we meet again, from me, Alan Robson, God bless you, and I wish you well.